I've always thought myself a practical man. My name's Tom Branson, and I've been fishing Boggy Creek for as long as I could remember. The swamp was my livelihood, my sanctuary, a place where the worries of the world melted away, and it was just me, the water, and the pull of the net. I'd heard the stories about the creature, of course. Everyone in FOUKE had. But to me, they were just tales to scare kids, stories to keep people entertained on a slow night. That all changed one day in the summer of 1969. The sun was high, beating down on the still waters. The swamp was quieter than usual. Not even the usual buzz of cicadas or croak of frogs broke the silence. I didn't think much of it at the time, just chalked it up to the heat. My boat glided across the water, and my nets came up heavy with fish. It was shaping up to be a good haul. I had just pulled in the last net when I heard it, a crashing sound, like something big tearing through the trees. I froze, my hands gripping the edge of the boat. My first thought was a bear. They're rare in this area, but not impossible. I stood there, waiting, listening. The crashing continued, then shifted direction, moving further away. Whatever it was big, and it was fast. Relieved, I stayed in my boat, figuring I'd let things settle before heading back. 20 minutes passed, and the swamp returned to its eerie silence. I decided to call it a day. I started gathering my fish, the sun reflecting off their scales, when I smelled it. A stench so foul it made me gag. It was like rotting meat left out in the sun mixed with wet dog. I looked up, and that's when I saw it. It was standing on the bank, maybe 30 yards away, partially hidden in the shadow of the trees. At first I thought it was just another trick of the light, a bear maybe, or a large deer. But as I stared, it became clear this was no animal I'd ever seen. It was massive, towering at least 8 feet tall, with long, gangly limbs. Its body was covered in dark, matted hair, but what struck me most was its posture. It stood upright, like a man, but its movements were animalistic, predatory. The sun was behind it, casting its face in shadow. I squinted, using my hand to block the glare, and that's when I saw it had moved. It was closer now, its amber eyes locked onto me, unblinking. My heart nearly stopped. I grabbed my shotgun, the one I always kept in the boat for gators, and leveled it at the thing. It took a step forward, its foot splashing in the shallow water. I shouted at it, hoping the noise would scare it off, but it didn't even flinch. Instead, it started moving closer, its strides slow and deliberate. The smell grew stronger as it approached. My hands shook as I fired a shot, the sound echoing across the swamp. The creature stopped, letting out a scream that I can only describe as hellish. It was a mix of a guttural growl and a high-pitched wail, so loud it felt like it was rattling my bones. Then it charged. I didn't think. I grabbed my sack of fish and bolted, leaping out of the boat and scrambling up the bank toward my car. My boots slipped in the mud, my lungs burned, and I could hear it crashing behind me. The swamp seemed to close in, the trees twisting and looming like they were trying to trap me. Halfway to the car, I stumbled, dropping the sack of fish. I turned, expecting the creature to be on me, but it had stopped. It crouched over the spilled fish, sniffing them before scooping them up with its clawed hands. It looked at me one last time, its eyes gleaming with something I still can't describe. Hunger, maybe, or rage. Then it turned and disappeared into the trees. I didn't wait around to see if it would come back. I reached my car, hands shaking so bad I could barely get the keys in the ignition. I floored it out of there, not stopping until I was back in town. The police didn't believe me, of course. They sent out a couple of deputies to investigate, but all they found were some odd tracks in the mud and signs of something large moving through the trees. That night, one of their K9 dogs went missing while they were combing the area. The next morning, I went back with a few of the braver locals to retrieve my boat. What we found chilled me to the core. was torn apart. The wood splintered and clawed as if something had tried to rip it in half. There were deep gouges in the side, each one as wide as my hand. I've never gone back to Boggy Creek after that. Whatever's out there, it's real. I don't care if people call me crazy or say I'm making it up. I know what I saw. I know what I heard. And I know I barely made it out alive. My name is Mary Ann Clark. In the summer of 1978, my life changed forever. Before that summer, I was a proud, independent widow, living in the house my late husband built deep in the Boggy Creek swamps. The quiet of the swamp suited me. I didn't mind the solitude, and I had enough visitors, local hunters, fishermen, and tradesmen, to keep me from feeling completely alone. Most of them were younger men, charming in their way, and always eager to lend a hand. But my heart leaned toward Daniel, a local house builder. He was kind, soft-spoken, and thoughtful in ways that meant more to me than the bravado of the others. That summer evening started like so many others. I sat on my porch, listening to the frogs and crickets, their calls a comforting melody that had been my nightly companion for years. But then suddenly they stopped. The silence hit me like a slap. It wasn't natural. Then came the smell. It was vile, a sickening combination of rotting flesh and sour decay. I covered my nose with a handkerchief, my eyes watering as I stood frozen on the porch. That's when I saw it. At first it was just movement, something large shifting between the trees. Then it stepped into a patch of moonlight, and I got a better look. It was massive, at least 8 feet tall, with broad shoulders and thick, matted hair that hung off its body in clumps. Its head was slightly conical, its eyes reflecting the faint light in an unnatural way. It didn't see me, thank God, but it was close enough that I could hear its heavy breathing. I held my breath until it disappeared into the trees. The next morning, I told the first visitors to my home, 5 of the younger men who often stopped by to chat, about what I had seen. They laughed nervously at first, but when they saw the fear in my eyes, their expressions changed. "We'll check it out for you, Miss Mary Ann," said one, his voice tinged with bravado. Together, they ventured into the swamp, armed with rifles and flashlights. I followed a short distance behind, my heart pounding. It didn't take long to find signs of something unnatural. Massive tracks marred the soft earth, their size far beyond anything that could belong to a man or animal. "Whatever made these ain't normal," one of the men muttered. Further along, we found a deer carcass floating in the water, its body ripped apart as if by something with incredible strength. The men looked at me, their faces pale. "Do you want us to stay the night?" one asked, but I declined. I didn't want to put them in harm's way. Deep down, I knew they'd show up anyway, and truthfully, I didn't mind the thought of extra protection. That night, I sat in the darkened living room, leafing through an old book I had about Gigantopithecus, an ancient ape species. The thought that such a creature could exist in the swamp was absurd, but so was what I had seen. A knock at the door startled me. It was Daniel. "I heard about what happened," he said, stepping inside. "Please, Mary Ann, come stay in town with me. It's safer there. This swamp isn't right anymore." His voice was steady, but I could see the worry in his eyes. I kissed him then, surprising us both. For an hour we sat together, talking and laughing softly, the tension of the day momentarily forgotten. But then, the frogs and crickets fell silent again. The footsteps came next, heavy and deliberate, circling the house. Daniel's face went pale, and he motioned for me to stay quiet. We could hear it breathing outside, its massive form brushing against the walls as it moved. The sound of approaching voices broke the tension. The young men were returning. Daniel quietly opened the door and warned them of what was happening. They crouched, their rifles ready, as we all waited in terrified dead silence. The back door exploded inward. The creature stepped into the house, its hulking frame filling the doorway. It was even larger up close, its eyes gleaming with intelligence and malice. The smell was overwhelming. For a moment, no one moved. Then, as if on instinct, the men opened fire. The shots were deafening in the enclosed space. The creature staggered, its massive body crashing to the floor, splintering the wooden boards. But even as it fell, it didn't scream. It didn't cry out. It just collapsed with a thud that shook the house. We didn't stay to see what happened next. We ran through the swamp, not stopping until we reached the sheriff's office. When we returned to the house with the deputies, the creature was gone. Deep gouges in the floor showed where it had fallen, but it looked like something had dragged it away. The next day, I packed my things. I couldn't stay in that house anymore. Daniel helped me move into his home in town, and for the first time in years, I felt safe. But even now, decades later, I can't forget the sight of that thing, or the sound of its footsteps circling my home. I've stopped trying to make sense of it. Some things I've learned are better left unexplained. People call me Old Red. I'm not proud of the nickname, but I've earned it after decades of poaching in the swamps of Boggy Creek. I've been at odds with the sheriff's office more times than I can count, and I know every tree and trail in these woods better than I know my own house. That's why, when those 3 teenage boys went missing in the summer of 1987, the locals came to me. "Red, you gotta find them boys. You know these swamps better than anyone," one woman said, tears in her eyes. Others weren't so kind. "Let the law handle it," they said. "Red's just looking for another way to stir trouble." But I couldn't shake the feeling in my gut. Those kids didn't just get lost. Something happened to them. Something worse. I knew what it was. I'd believed in the Boggy Creek creature for years, even if the sheriff and his deputies laughed in my face every time I mentioned it. I wasn't about to sit around and wait for the law to stumble over themselves. I decided to take matters into my own hands. The sheriff reluctantly agreed to let me join their search effort. "Meet us at the edge of the woods," he said, "and we'll go from there." But I didn't wait. I was already deep into the swamp before the dogs started barking in the distance, giving away their position. "Damn fools," I muttered. I stomped back toward them, furious at their noise. By the time I reached the sheriff and his deputies, their dogs were barking up a storm. "Would you shut those damn dogs up?" I hissed. "This is why I wanted to go alone. You're gonna scare off anything out here, or worse, piss it off." The sheriff, a barrel-chested man with a sour disposition, shot me a glare. "And you went against my orders, Red. You think you're above the law? I should cuff you right now." "Do it later," I snapped. "I've got a lead." Against his better judgment, he followed me deeper into the swamp. The air grew heavier as the sun dipped below the horizon, shadows swallowing the woods whole. "They've been here," I said, pointing to a patch of broken branches and disturbed earth. Either they were running, or something was chasing them. The sheriff snorted. "Don't start with your monster stories, Red. Probably a drifter or a serial killer. Something real, not some swamp fairy tale. We came across what looked like a beaver dam, but inside was something far stranger. A makeshift bed of twigs and leaves, large enough to fit a man." "Looks like we found your wild man," the sheriff said, laughing as his men took a break nearby. One of the dogs wandered off to drink from a nearby stream, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. "We're wasting time," I said, my patience wearing thin. "We need to keep moving." The sheriff turned on me, his face red with anger. "Listen, Red, I've had about enough of your mouth. For once in your miserable life, shut up and let someone else lead." I snapped. Dropping my rifle, I lunged at him, fists flying. We rolled in the mud, cursing and throwing punches like a couple of drunks outside a bar. His deputies finally pulled us apart, and I stood there seething while the sheriff rubbed his jaw. "That's it," he said, his voice low and venomous. "You're done." Back at the station, I sat behind bars, glaring at the sheriff as he leaned against his desk. "You know I'm right," I said. "You saw the tracks, the signs. Those boys were there, and so was something else." "Shut up, Red," he said, lighting a cigarette. "As far as I'm concerned, you're a danger to yourself and everyone else. I'll let you out in the morning if you keep quiet." Morning came too soon. I was dozing when the phone rang, the shrill sound echoing in the small station. The sheriff answered, his usual gruff demeanor slipping away as he listened. His face turned pale, his eyes wide with something I hadn't seen before. Fear. "What is it?" I asked, gripping the cell bars. He hung up the phone slowly and sat down across from me, his hands trembling. "My deputies," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "The 4 I left in the woods. They never came back." I felt a chill crawl up my spine. "What do you mean they never came back?" "They radioed in around midnight," he said, his words shaky. "Said they saw something big. Then the line went dead. We sent out a search party at dawn. All we found were their rifles, broken in half like twigs. The dogs are gone too." The silence between us was heavy, suffocating. For the first time, the sheriff looked at me not with contempt, but with something closer to understanding. "You think it was your monster, don't you?" he asked. I didn't answer. I didn't need to. The fear in his eyes said it all. Neither of us spoke as the sun rose higher, casting long shadows through the station windows. Somewhere out in the swamp, something waited. Something we both knew was real.